I'm Alessandro Giudice, and I will be moderating this panel. So good afternoon, everyone, and salam alaikum. And I'm going to introduce the four speakers of this panel. Townsend. Danny Townsend is the CEO of SRJ Sports Investments. As you may know, it's the business entity set up by PIF last year to accelerate the growth of sports in Saudi Arabia and to propel investments in the industry. And Danny comes from the football industry. He was the CEO for some years of the Australian professional football leagues. So thanks, Danny, and welcome here.
Thank you.
Our next, I'm going to welcome Angus Buchanan. Angus.
Hi.
Angus is the CEO and founder of the Sport Consultancy, a prominent consultancy firm operating in virtually every angle of the sports industry. And Angus has an impressive experience, a 25-year experience in the industry, so he's an expert of everything. He's a lawyer originally, and then he turned into a successful management consultant. His expertise ranges from the negotiation of football rights, and he's been working with virtually everyone in the industry, you name it, Formula One, the America's Cup, the Rugby League. Thank you for being here. Then I'm going to welcome Donal McElwee. Donal, thank you for being with us. He's the managing partner of Portas Consultants. Portas is an international firm specialized in many aspects of the sports industry, and he's going to be with us, and we'll be discussing most of the activities. They are very active in assisting governments, football federations, sports federations, entities, associations that operate in the industry of sports. And our fourth speaker is Ahmed Abdoun. Ahmed is the founder of 7 Sports. Thank you. Welcome. 7 Sports and Events Group is based in Cairo and Dubai. He's a successful entrepreneur. He's been active for many years in many aspects of sports, from grassroots investments to management of rights of sports persons like footballers, gymnasts, squash players. So it's going to give us an angle from the entrepreneurial point of view. So thanks for being here, and I will start my ride from Danny. And you've been now 6 months or more, maybe, in the SRJ. Could you give us a flavor of what the vision of SRJ is and what you are planning to achieve, and especially what really, if anything, differentiates SRJ from the traditional PE firms in the industries, people like CVC or private equity, that because you have a public flavor, a public angle. So what's the difference in strategy between you and these guys?
That's 5 questions in one.
Yes.
No, look, thank you, Alessandro. I'll give you a bit of background on Surge and why we exist. Obviously, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia has made some investments in sport that predated the establishment of Surge. But the reason for establishing the portfolio company of the PIF to invest in sport was really to drive a focus around the sector. I think when you look at private equity companies investing in sport, very few of them actually have a specialisation in doing deals in the sector. And I think we were just talking about it in the lunch area that it's difficult to do deals, good deals in sport, because of the construct of the industry. You have governance models that typically preside over a certain sport. You've got certain stakeholders in that often aren't geared up to take on investment. So getting to a point where you can actually invest in a sport is a challenging thing to do. So having expertise there is important. So Surge was established to build that expertise in the kingdom, but what makes us a little bit different to most private equity companies is that we have a bit of a dual responsibility. Our job as a sport investment company, as our name will tell you, is about making money. So deploying the capital of the PIF into the sector for a return. But we also have a responsibility to drive the MENA sports economy, and more specifically the Saudi Arabian sports economy. Like most sectors within Saudi, it's the sports sector is a developing one. It's been around for a long time, but it's maturing at a pace that needs support. And for us, the investments we're making in global sport must have some form of localisation componentry to them that will enable us to land some form of event experience, a participatory experience, a development pathway experience, a facility experience, whatever it might be that will enable that sport to come to life in the kingdom, and then build interest around that sport that ultimately drives participation and mobility outcomes in line with His Royal Highness's Vision 2030. So that's sort of us. We sort of have a few other differences that I think are unique in that we also enable the kingdom to come together in one to invest around sport. Private equity companies are typically investing capital. What Surge is able to do is invest our capital, but also bring with us ambitious Saudi brands that want to invest in sponsorship and partnerships of major sports around the world to build their profile. And we have an ambitious tourism authority that wants to bring major events to the kingdom. So being able to go into a sport and say, we can help you on the balance sheet with some capital, but we can also bring recurring revenue into your P&Ls, which drives the enterprise value of the investment we're making, is a pretty unique thing that so far the market's responding well to.
Thank you. And talking of, you mentioned big sports events, I want to go to Angus. It is undoubted that big events have been a driver in raising the interest in sports in the region. Talking of obviously the Qatar World Cup and the Formula One in Jeddah. What do you think the sports event, big events, can bring to the region in terms of economic growth, in terms of promotion of the sports? What could we expect? Could we expect more big events and from big events more growth, or you think it's now time to operate on a wider basis?
So I think there are a number of ways in which the Qatar World Cup, for example, and the Formula One events that are happening across the region bring economic growth. Typically, around a World Cup, for example, you'll see significant investment go, in the case of Qatar, into the wider events ecosystem. And that is there, obviously, to serve the World Cup, but then is something which will serve events coming into Qatar post-World Cup. I think Danny's an Australian, I'm English. We probably both saw a significant premium that attached to first Australian and now British consultancies and experts following first Sydney and then London 2012 Olympic Games. And that creates a real sort of flywheel in the region in terms of generating more value, attracting more events, servicing more events coming into the region. In the UK, and again picking up on your point around Formula One, in the UK now, I think there are around 4,500 businesses which serve motorsport in one way or another, and there's a real premium on high-performance engineering, for example. I think most of those businesses are very export-led, so I think 80 to 90% of their business is exported into the wider world, and I think we'll see the same thing in the region. So as events are hosted, it creates more capacity within the supply chain, and that builds the level of expertise that comes with a premium, which can then be used to generate export services, but also to supply events as they come more into the region. And the second thing is, again, taking the Qatar World Cup, I've got 8 world-class stadia which need content. And so much of our work in region now and in Qatar is helping think through what next, what comes in programmatically into those stadia to generate content to make those stadia work commercially in the long term.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And Daniel, you work with governments, with sports institutions, so you have a very good angle of observation. I would like to follow up from Angus' response. And what do you see in terms of how can the enthusiasm and the passion that there is in the region and these big events coming to the region, big leagues growing in the region. How can this follow up?
Well, I would start with just saying how incredible the passion and enthusiasm for sport in the region is. Recently, when I attended the World Cup in Doha, you could see the Moroccan fans, and they had that great run to the semi-final. I was fortunate enough to be at the Saudi-Argentina game where Saudi beat the eventual world champions, and the passion was incredible. I think one of the differences in recent years now is taking that passion and enthusiasm and introducing it to, firstly, a wider set of sports. So previously, a lot of sports outside of Europe and North America was very focused on football. Since I've been in Saudi, we've gone from 35 sports federations back in 2015 to 100 sports federations, including new sports such as paddle federations or rugby or MMA, so that growth in the variety of sports. But most fundamentally, it's the change in the view of sports as an economic sector. So moving sports from just being something that's good to enjoy and it's something to consume to actually seeing it as a genuine economic sector. And if I take the example of Saudi, what's really changed the game there was that sports was seen as a fundamental part of the Vision 2030 transformation agenda, both a social impact as well as an economic impact for the nation. That's been underpinned by very clear KPIs and targets for sports. So, for example, there's a target to reach 3% of non-oil GDP through the sports economy. Over the time, again, that I've been in Saudi from 2015, we've moved from sports as being a general presidency, which meant it was lumped with youth. So it was lower in the ecosystem. It's now a fully blown ministry focused exclusively on sport. Actually puts it ahead of the UK, where you still have a Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So that focus is important. Not all MENA countries have adopted that. In some of the countries, it still remains a Ministry of Sport and Youth, so there's lack of focus. You cascade then that focus in Saudi to other bodies with funding and with governance structures, whether that be mega projects in cities, and all of them have sports as a core sector. So it's really getting that focus. And then key to all of this is building out the entire sporting ecosystem. So looking at the full value chain. It's not just the events, it's not just the sports competitions, it's all of the things around it that Angus and Danny touched upon. In the event world, you need a value chain. Who's going to deliver the events? Is that local companies? Who's going to provide the retail? Can you create local retail companies? If you're building stadiums for major events, can you create the manufacturing base? So, and then finally, I think what's going to really take that enthusiasm into into an economic outcome is engaging the private sector. Historically, the private sector in MENA has probably not been so involved in sports as an area of economic return, but we're really seeing that changing. In fact, some of the conversations I've had around this conference have been people representing family wealth offices that are now looking for the first time to move into sports in the region and invest.
Thank you. Ahmed, you bring a parallel angle of observation here because you work more on the ground of sports. Your investments and your activities range from grassroots investments to representing athletes. So what's your point of view? What do you see sports investments bringing value in the region? What kind of development can you see from your side?
Okay, so let me just thank you for the invitation. So basically, the sports investments, just as Donal was saying, in the past era, the private sector was not really involved in the ecosystem. It was basically all managed by the government or by different federations and organizations related more to the organizations. And then with time, as you've seen, it was exemplified with the introduction of or the launch of the World Cup in in Qatar, and then with more and more events, Formula One is being now done at four cities in the Gulf. So the private sector has grown massively with events, just like also Angus was saying. So we've been hosting the Super Cup of La Liga, the Super Cup of Serie A. So all this has a lot of positive economic feedback, economic growth, whether in terms of construction, in terms of job opportunities, broadcasting, media rights, and at the same time, the ecosystem, just as Donal was saying, is being changed at the moment. And it's more skewed towards the digitalizing the ecosystem. So it first starts with knowing your audience, and then catering the product to your audience. Lately, more than the new generations and Gen Z are more interested towards following on highlights rather than following the full matches. So that's why you'd find platforms like TikTok and YouTube Shorts. They're more interested and excited about the highlights, and then you'd find the highlights being sold to different entities, so that you can cater and create more fan engagement with the younger generations, and then make sure that you have a consistency in the spread of the sport across the generations.
Thank you. I come to Daniel. When I look at sports events, people think of something that is where the consumption occurs at the very moment when the event happens. So you switch off TV and the event is over. But then the value creation usually occurs if you can build up intellectual property, if you can generate contents that can become viral and they circulate across media. So what on your side with your investments that you're planning to do in the region, in the industry, how do you see the process of value creation happening? Through which channels?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it has multi-facets in the way I'd answer that. But the first one is that the kingdom needs to move away from renting rights. When you rent rights, you have no longevity or no guarantee of longevity. So part of what Serge's mandate is to fill a calendar of world-class events in the kingdom with assets that we own. So we can guarantee they're going to be in the kingdom in perpetuity. You rent rights for a 3-year period. If you bid for those rights and you're successful and you have a great event, there's no guarantee that that event's going to be there in the 4th year, which makes it very hard to build a long, sustainable economy around that sport. So if you take tennis as an example, when you think about the WTA finals that's just been announced, which is fantastic for Saudi Arabia, in 3 years that's going to come up again. And that's going to be a competitive bid with a lot of other countries around the world that want to host that. We've got to build infrastructure to host that event. We've got to build a talent development pathway around that event. But if that event goes away, the jewel in the crown is gone. So you need to, if you own the asset, you can build long-term plans around that asset to ensure that you're actually getting the benefit that you're seeking. There's no coincidence why in Australia in January there are more tennis rackets sold in that 1 month of the year than the following 11, because the Australian Open's on. And it inspires people to get off the couch and learn tennis. And that's exactly what we want to do in Saudi Arabia, is inspire young Saudis to participate in sport through that inspiration that a major event does. But you need that inspiration to be consistent year in, year out, and owning rights enables you to do that. I think the second part of that, which relates to content and how you then bring that event to life, we have a big focus on Serge around digital transformation and ensuring whatever sport we're investing in, they are committed to product reform, which is change their product to ensure that it is meeting the needs of a modern consumer and not just sitting on the same sport they had for 50 years because it's worked. And secondly, that they start focusing on building a digital economy around their sport, because ultimately the reliance on linear broadcast money in sport is going to force sports to change whether they like it or not. And typically to build a digital economy around your sport, it takes time, sophistication and money, and most sports don't have one of those 3 things, let alone all 3. Our capital enables that transformation to happen it speeds up the timeline, it can buy you sophistication. So we're big on ensuring that whatever we're investing in, there is a commitment to build that digital economy around the consumer so we can directly influence and support their customer journey in that sport and ensure that the economy around that is continuing to create that flywheel effect that Angus talked about. So I think it's really about owning assets and then bringing those assets to life through commitment to digital transformation. Thank you.
Angus, then it touched the magic word of infrastructures, and sports investment requires a big investment infrastructure is the key. But usually one criticism that is posed is that you organize big events, you build up from ground these big infrastructures, and the event is over and the infrastructure is there, unproductive. So the key is to generate financial return from that investment as well in the longer run. So how do you think this is possible, and what is the best way to do it?
Stadia now, when built, the new trend clearly is to follow what we've seen happening in this city with, I hate to mention them because they're the rival club to Arsenal, who I support, but Spurs Stadia, I think a piece of populist planning. Equally, the new Bernabeu Real Madrid Stadia and the shortly to come on stream new really are rethinking the purpose of a stadia. So a stadia historically has been seen as something which generates revenue through match day, football match day, and now is turning necessarily into an asset which the stadium owner operator is trying to monetize 365 days of the year with multiple forms of programmatic content, be that, of course, match day in football, but then moving into live entertainment. And we've even seen and worked with entities like Singapore Sports Hub, where, funnily enough, we did a deal with the WTA to host the WTA finals some years ago, which was the biggest deal at the time in women's sport. I think you've just eclipsed it. And really interestingly, around that piece of, it was a PPP investment, so it was both public and private sector investment in the stadia. They took a really early on in this trend, a very open view to the way in which they were going to monetize that. So you have a stadia which is also doubling up as both a community asset, so running tracks around it, but also as an asset which is used in retail. And then I think in that case didn't have an anchor tenant in terms of a football club, but was instead bringing in events like the one we brought, WTA finals, but hosting other major sport and entertainment events. And it has mixed modality on the pitches, which you've seen with Spurs. With Spurs, they have the football mode, but they also have an F1 car academy underneath, and they're bringing in NFL. So you're thinking very openly about how you program content into that 365 days a year. I think the final point is around sponsorship, which I think you mentioned, which I think is now interconnected. So we've seen in the UK at least around 150 million quid's worth of annual naming rights deals done for stadia. In the US, it's a really big market, but it's actually softened a little bit in recent years. That was until they started doing exactly what I've just mentioned, which is thinking of stadia not just for a football season or for an NFL season, but year-round. And that makes it a much more attractive proposition for the sponsors to attach to, because you're really then reaching across a much wider range of events with much wider demographics and a much wider media reach. So I think that's very much rethinking the way in which we think about stadia and their role within a community or a city.
And that involves much wider thinking than the simple sports destination.
They can't really survive. Most major large stadia, I think, cannot be sustainable commercially without thinking about a much broader use.
All right, thank you. Donal, I read an article from yours recently, very interesting. I studied for this panel, it's not just improvising. I was captured by a figure. You mentioned that sports industry in the MENA region is expected to grow at 8.7% in the next couple of years, compared to 3.3% globally. Yeah. What are if you can just summarize the drivers that are behind this gap in growth? I mean, it's an impressive...
Yes, it's an impressive number. It's not actually our data. I took that from a PwC report on the region, but it rings true. The region is growing faster. We're experiencing it in our own business, and there's a lot of evidence that points to MENA becoming truly a global hub for sports. What's driving it? I think, as I mentioned in the first question, sports is becoming part of the economic plan for many of the countries going through transformation. So it's ingrained within their transformation plans. Secondly, there is quite simply an unparalleled level of investment going into sports from MENA. There is nowhere at this point in time investing into sports in the way that MENA is investing, and so that's also driving this growth. You mentioned facilities earlier. There's a huge build program going on across MENA, and if I look at Saudi, where you have new mega developments, mega projects, city expansions, sports is a central part of the conversation in all of those, and so master plans are now being created with sports ingrained in them, which again is going to really provide the supply side for citizens and investors to get more involved. And then lastly, we're seeing many global sports that need to expand, need to get more investment, and they're really looking seriously at the MENA region. And I've met a few different leaders of sports organizations that are more Eurocentric or US-centric this week, and they need to expand. They need to provide their sport to a broader audience, whether that be MENA or Asia, and many of them want an introduction to Danny, so I'll do my best to hold them off. But the point is that globally now, and particularly in the last few years, owners of sports IP and sports events and sports programs, sports technology around the world see the ambition of MENA in this area and are starting to reach out and really, and it's a two-way relationship.
Thank you. Ahmed, I want to come to you. You are most involved in grassroots development. And when you look at emerging markets in sport, the MENA region is an emerging region in sports. We tend to think as a consumers market, consumers of content, consumers of broadcasting, whatever. But there is a big market, a big potential in terms of athletes, young people, passion. And you have already been seeing in Egypt the growth of a generation of athletes who have made it into the big leagues. You represent some of those.
Yeah.
What potential you see there? How can that potential be used in the best possible way?
So basically, you're talking about the squash players, and
also, yeah, that was
yes,
my next question. But you,
yeah. So specifically, the squash players are the one of the, we have like 5 of the top 10 women and men world champions. So basically, this has been done and cultivated through a generation and through the love of the sport, with a very good ecosystem of coaches and of facilities, which has then been transformed into hosting big sports events. So Egypt hosts 4 of the top 8 squash events of the world, with very nice backgrounds and venues, so whether at the new museums or at the pyramids. So this has been going through in Egypt for the past like 20, 30 years, which had then the potential of cultivating all what was happening in the 20, 30 years back to having the top world squash players now. So I think it's the turn now goes to other sports to be able to reach the potential. Of course, one very big objective for Egypt now is an Olympic medal for the squash, and squash will be one of the Olympic Games in Los Angeles 2028. And then as we move on with other sports, I think with all the investments that the panelists were discussing now, Egypt might not be on the scene of the major investments like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE. However, Egypt as a population, as we've mentioned, it's a very young population. It's a highly consumable market. So and as well, practicing sports in Egypt has increased massively the past past couple of years. We're more than 120 million. Half of them are younger than 35 years old. So I think the potential will start from increasing the practice levels, and then moving on to the full ecosystem of events attendance, and then moving whoever is practicing and whoever is excelling in any sport to being a professional athlete, and then the rest should be logical.
So it seems like a tremendous case study. I didn't know that Egypt was so strong. So the squash was so popular in Egypt, but it seems like a tremendous case study for how you can develop from the ground discipline.
Yes, Egypt is famous with basically two sports. It's globally, it's either squash or handball. Those are our best two sports, and they share a lot of the same verticals that I've mentioned before. That, as I mentioned, the challenge now is to widen this, and that's happening with the emerge of new sports and innovative sports like paddle. Paddle is growing like hell in Egypt, and you would find now that the Egyptian team is starting to be the best Arab team. Of course, there are still big gaps between Egypt and other countries like Argentina, Spain, but I think we're on the right track. Yet the role of foreign investment should be much more focused with Egypt, especially that, as I mentioned, we're 120 million. We're a very young generation, so I think it is time that the focus happens on Egypt from outside outside investment or foreign investment.
Danny, you mentioned the recent moves with the WTA, the WTA finals, but it's in the press also, the contacts and the partnerships that you have been working on with the WTA. SRJ also made an investment in the Professional Fighters League. So it seems an expansion in horizontal expansion. So it's not just the football and the big the Formula One, but it's a lot of things going on. So is your strategy going to continue in this direction? What challenges do you see in this?
Yeah, look, I think for us, we've got a bit of a broad canvas, but we do follow the Ministry of Sport's 20 priority sports. So that's where we start, and there's 20 sports there to conquer before you need to think about number 21. So there's a lot there. Our first investment was into combat sports because it is in the top 20. It's an important sport for the kingdom. It's already a sport with a significant participation base. But for us, the thesis there was around UFC being a very dominant player in MMA, and a lot of sort of other promoters, fair way back by buying PFL and merging them with Bellator, which were two challenger brands. We created a very clear number two in the market, and we think there's a lot of growth. There's a lot of growth in MMA more broadly, and I think being able to take advantage of that sort of greenfield space was the thesis for that investment. But when we think more broadly, we look at sports that have significant participation bases around the world. So lots of people playing those sports is important for us. Serving the big economies, as an investor, you want to make sure you're acquiring assets that are relevant in the biggest commercial economies in the world. So that's important to us. Having the ability to localise, as I said in the outset there, is an important component for us. But we also, as I said, that digital nascency is important, that there is growth, that they haven't quite managed to capture the consumer like they're going to need to over the next decade in order to bridge that gap from that sort of analogue reliance on the way sport did business to the way it's going to do business in the future. So really we look at all those type of things, and we take our market landscape and work out which sports are meeting those criteria. But the other sort of bit that we talked about right at the start is it's hard, because if I listed those 20 sports out, there's probably 6 or 7 of them that just don't have a structure that would enable private investment to even get involved, even if we wanted to. So, as much as there is a wide canvas, I think there's also some challenges in the sports space that require change and innovation to the structure in which the sport conducts its business. And I think we're in a couple of deals at the moment where we're very much around trying to work with the existing stakeholder group of the sport to get them into an organised fashion that will enable them to come together, whether it be the federation the players, the teams, the various other stakeholders in that, and do all that whilst keeping in mind the fans are important stakeholders in whatever we do, because if you lose the fan, you're essentially losing the consumer. And that's not something that makes for a good investment. So there's lots of complexity to the sector. I think the way we're thinking about it, aligned to the strengths of the Ministry of Sport, but also looking more further afield in terms of where, fishing where the fish are. And that's something that I think will serve us well if we stick to that.
You're right, the fans are the consumers, but they're also part of the show. So actually, when you watch a sport event, the crowd is part of the show. So if you're missing that, it's just...
Absolutely, it's all connected. I think, our philosophy again is around participation is really important, not only because we want to see the participation levels increase across the region, but if you play the game, you're more likely to watch the game and then consume the game as a transactional fan, a fan that actually spends money. So if we can connect participants with the live experience, then we're going to be far more successful. Trying to invest in a sport that just does not have that participation base means you really only can convince them on the entertainment value of the product, and that's challenging. Thank you.
Angus, I read an interesting publication from the Sport Consultancy. You published I was intrigued by the methodology. It's the monetary value of sports events in the UK. And it was actually very interesting the way you came up with that. What can you say if you had to replicate the same methodology, the same approach to an emerging region like MENA? What would you think? Is the monetary value higher in an emerging region, or is lower? Or maybe it's lower now and it could become higher, and how?
Thank you for the compliment. It was a cracking read, I have to say.
World class.
Danny said how much he enjoyed it, actually. But look, I think, the first thing to say is that's not the first of those that we've done for UK government. And the reason I mention that is because it's a little bit of a snapshot. And we looked at 2023 for that window. And I think we looked at the events that UK government had publicly funded. And they spent around 10 million sterling in investing in those events, and there's something like close to 400 million of economic impact and return, which by anybody's book is pretty good investment. But what was missing last year in 2023, and I'm not, there's not a sort of backhanded slight to the big event last year in the UK, was the Cycling World Championship, which was the first time the UCI had combined a load of cycling championships in one. So that was the big event last year. But what the UK, I think, has been missing in the last few years is the sort of mega event. I think the last really big event we hosted was the Commonwealth Games. And there's not a load more actually in pipeline at the moment. And I know that's something that government's trying to address. So if you looked at those 16 events and you said that's nearly £400 million worth of impact, it's missing the private sector events, and by that I mean Wimbledon, the Grand National, London Marathon, etc., which in a mature market like this are quite substantial and will generate a very significant amount of income. So to answer your question directly, across the MENA region, big region, hosting events like the Dubai Desert Classic, the DP World Tour events, the Saudi and Dubai Flat Racing World Cups, all of the other major events like F1 4 times through the season, I would say easily the economic impact across the MENA region would exceed 400 million from those events. What, again, to answer your question, will really change the game is the fact that across Saudi, across Qatar, into the UAE, the wider region, there are going to be a number of very, very big events coming down the road. And those you should expect will themselves generate very significant economic impact. So the UK will continue to depend on its very mature markets, very mature events, with its event going public. I think that's obviously emerging. As Donal said, that's something that's really emerging in the region and will continue to generate economic impact. So I think the future is pretty bright, and events will continue to bring very significant economic impact into the region, which we'll look forward to measuring.
It sounds like a very promising outlook. I want to go to Donal, and maybe let's try to see if we can see some bleak spots in this outlook, which looks very optimistic and very, very positive. But there have been errors in the management of big events in the past in many Western countries. I mean, I won't mention, but there have been serious blows in some of them. Now, what are the errors that you think should be avoided or should be the lessons that should be learned from those errors to prevent this happening in the MENA region?
Yeah, well, I noticed you didn't name the countries that have failed to deliver those major events in a way that's delivered economic return. I think, first of all, big events are expensive and they're very public. So if you don't achieve the right outcomes, you are open to criticism. It's also worth saying that big events are not just about economic return. There's often broader social and reputational benefits, some of which can also be quantified as part of the reason that a country or a city would invest into those events. But for MENA specifically, what lessons can they learn? Well, if I start with Qatar and their World Cup, I mean, it still remains to be seen what the legacy will be. But already, they would say of the $220 billion that was spent on delivering that World Cup, $200 billion was infrastructure projects, airports, rail, metros, roads, and so on, that would have happened anyway. And the major event just provided an impetus and a focus to do that. So, you know, already there's an element of infrastructure legacy that probably wouldn't have happened as fast without that target of a World Cup. We've been fortunate enough to be involved in the motor sports that have been taking place in Saudi since the Formula E back in, I think, 2017. But if I look at the Formula One as an example, we've been tracking every year its impact in Saudi, and every year the local impact has increased. The number of delivery partners, vendors, and sponsors that are actually from the Saudi ecosystem has increased, and that's been very deliberate. It's been a target, and it's been something that they've focused on to ensure, as Danny mentioned, that you're not just purely renting, you're actually retaining value. Otherwise, the money just flows out of the country with the event once it's been delivered. And then the last, I'd say, lesson is to ensure that you think about the whole calendar of events in a joined-up way. So if you are hosting major events in a selection of sports, how does that fit with an overall proposition that your country or your city has? Does it have the full, let's call it, pyramid of events as well? So you're not just hosting the biggest and the best football events, you're also hosting all the way down to city level and community level events that gets people actively involved. And just to finish on that point, I mean, one of the great things about the major events in Saudi since they've started is they have had a direct impact on participation in sports behaviours. In 2015, when we looked at the number of Saudis who were actively engaged in sport once a week or more, it was only 13% of the population. That figure has now grown to close to 50%, and a large part of that is down to that exposure to new sports, bringing major events, and inspiring people to take part in sports themselves.
Thank you. That's very clear. I think it's been a very interesting panel and very productive. And the audience on a Sunday afternoon testifies that the interest in sports is always very high. I'm sure the sports in the region is going to grow immensely in the next few years, so it's certainly a topic to watch. I wish to thank all of you and the audience for being so patient, and wish you all the best for your future endeavors. Thank you.